All right. Today we're very happy to welcome Ashley McElhinney all the way from the West Coast in San Jose. Ashley will be talking today about tree selection for the urban forest. Ashley is an urban forestry program assistant at Our City Forest, which is a nonprofit located in San Jose, California, where she previously served as an AmeriCorps member. Prior to her move out west, she graduated from University of Massachusetts Amherst with a bachelor's in environmental science and a master's in forest resources and arboriculture. She hopes to be an effective advocate for tree equity and climate resilient cities and to plant as many trees as possible. We're very happy to have her join us today. So Ashley, if you want to take over and go ahead and share your screen, we are happy to hear you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good morning, everybody. It's super interesting seeing where you are all located. I'm excited to hear your thoughts about this. I'm sure you all have interesting experiences. So I'll just jump into it. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about tree selection in the urban forest, specifically as it pertains to climate change. I'll briefly cover the issues, which I'm sure you're familiar with, convince you to care. I don't think I'll have to try very hard. And then just talk a little bit about how species selection can help with these issues. And then some challenges that are often faced and hopefully some solutions. So I'm sure I don't have to remind you that we're expected to see an increase in urban land. Looking at the Northeast, this is like a model of 3 different scenarios. I tend to go towards the worst case scenario, but in either scenario, over time, there's going to be a major increase in urban land in the Northeast. Massachusetts is one of 4 states projected to be over 50% urban land by 2050. And then looking more broadly at the US, this holds true as well. In 2010, it was 3.6% of urban land in the US, which is expected to more than double by 2060, which is all well and good, but it is really difficult for trees to survive in these urban areas. We annually lose 36 million trees in these areas each year, which accounts for $96 million lost in ecosystem services alone. The average lifespan of a tree in like a downtown urban area is between only 19 and 28 years, which when you think about trees that can survive for hundreds or thousands of years, that's really low. We're kind of robbing ourselves of the ecosystem services that mature trees provide. And then looking at climate change, of course, we're going to see changes in precipitation. You can see in this figure that it varies greatly depending on, if you're looking at a low emission scenario or a high emission scenario, and even like your exact location. So we're going to see an increase in extreme precipitation events, either a decrease or increase in annual precipitation. Changes in seasonality, such as a decrease in summer and an increase in winter. However, this increase in winter will be less snow and more rain, which, trees usually benefit from the snow melt in the Northeast for, when they really need it in the early spring. This means floods, droughts, more pest outbreaks, and other consequences, which ultimately leads to tree stress and mortality. And similarly, with changes in temperature, we might see up to 8 degrees increase by the end of the century, specifically in New England. We're looking at earlier springs and shorter winters, and an increase in extreme heat events. So this will cause heat stress, pest outbreaks, and more. And again, stress and mortality for our poor trees. So I know you guys already care if you're here, but just to reiterate that trees provide so many benefits. So I kind of look at this from left to right. So starting with the more broad benefits that all trees provide, such as releasing oxygen, sequestering carbon, providing habitat, and going to the right to the more urban specific benefits, such as providing building energy savings, minimize noise, reduce heat-related illness, increase people's feelings of well-being. And I did include like some dollar amounts, which can be helpful when trying to like make your case to others, I guess. Luckily, there are so many things we can do to help address these issues. The way I look at it is if we help urban trees adapt to the changing climate, they can help us mitigate much of the coinciding and negative effects. So like if we scratch their back, they'll scratch ours kind of thing. So some major action items we can take are making sure that we're providing proper tree care and regular maintenance, community-wide education, advocating for improved policies and funding. But what I want to focus on is kind of planning ahead by means of species selection. So figuring out which trees are tolerant of urban conditions, tolerant of not only current but future climate conditions, and which trees will support maintaining high levels of biodiversity. So just for context, I did create a urban tree selection guide specific to Massachusetts when I was a grad school at UMass Amherst with my advising professor, Rick Harper, which I'm sure some of you might know. So I'll be referencing this and just letting you know that you can still use it in other parts of the Northeast, but it was created with Massachusetts in mind. So selecting trees that do well in urban conditions is definitely tricky. There's, also reading this from left to right, trees not only have to put up with, the general sources of stress like natural disasters, insects, disease, drought, but the more anthropogenic sources of stress like poor soil drainage, restricted root space, improper care, road salt. And no trees really prefer these conditions, but some for sure tolerate them better than others. So good characteristics to look for are which trees can tolerate drought, heat, pollution, and variety of soil conditions. Often in the urban forest, we see poor drainage, soil salt, and really alkaline soils. So this is a screenshot from the guide, and you can see up in this right-hand corner, an icon I use to like signal which trees I found would be doing well in the urban forest. And then the other big piece that I focused on was looking at which species are maybe going to do well in our future climate. Currently, I think a lot of the species selection is kind of looking at decades of trial and error in a specific location, seeing like what does well in your climate area, which is definitely helpful to have that information of the past. Also using hardiness zones, which of course is like based on average annual minimum temperatures. So, which trees can survive the worst of your winters. But as you can see, these are going to shift over time and already have been shifting, but will be accelerating. So we also want to consider which trees are going to do well in the future climate. So this would be species that are currently in your area that may be able to adapt to these changing conditions, or species that may not be in your area yet, but are expected to gain habitat suitability naturally and, theoretically would be migrating over a long period of time. However, to keep pace with the changing conditions, a tree would have to migrate 3,000 to 5,000 meters each year to keep up. Whereas a maximum observed migration of any plant, let alone like a long-lived tree, is only 500 meters per year. So that's why I kind of propose thinking about assisted migration as a tool to help these species keep pace with these rapidly changing conditions. So it's kind of just a purposeful expansion of species range to areas where climate is expected to become more suitable. This is kind of 3 different actions, as you can see. There's population expansion, which is planting species at the northern edge of their current range. There's range expansion, which is planting species just outside of their current range. And translocation, which is planting species pretty far outside of their current range. And I find this figure as like a helpful way to think of these actions. So we're looking at the degree of change from current conditions. So kind of like how far you're moving a tree and the importance of the action. And then I added this bit. I know it's not like a linear thing by all means, but financial and ecological risk definitely increases the farther you go. So these are resistance, resilience, and transition. Resistance is almost like the lack of assisted migration. It's almost like the step before the first action. And this is preserving the present. So what you already have, species composition wise in your area, and maintaining age diversity, which is super important for the urban forest to get those benefits from the mature trees. So this can look like things like pest management and supplemental irrigation. I have this picture of some like sad San Jose redwoods. They definitely don't belong here, but I've heard of some areas making fog emitters towards the top of their urban redwoods to try to keep them healthier, which obviously isn't like a sustainable way to operate an urban forest. But if you really care about a tree, I guess it makes sense. And these species, more on like a broader scale, more for like reforesting efforts, I think you could choose which species are the most vulnerable and which you want to plant more of. Ones that have specific habitat needs, ranges limited by either geographic or fragmentation barriers, low dispersal rates, small populations, and already at the edge of its species range. Then we're getting into resilience. So kind of preparing for the uncertain, like diversifying your urban forest by planting currently local species that are either expected to adapt to changing conditions, which can be like hard to know for sure, but good things to look for are heat and drought tolerance and generally free of major pest and pathogen issues. And species that are expected to gain habitat suitability. So looking at this first step of population expansion. And then there's transition, which is, facilitating the change by means of range expansion and translocation. So this is planting species that may not yet be in your area, but are expected to gain new habitat suitability. I think it's really important to provide a lot of attentive care during the establishment period to make sure they get everything they need to do well. And of course, long-term monitoring. So hopefully you can use this trial and error as a learning experience for others. So this is another snapshot from the guide. I included a list of what I call candidates for assisted migration specific to Massachusetts, species who may be gaining the habitat suitability or completely new habitat, ones that haven't gotten there quite yet, while maintaining high levels of adaptability. And this is like by no means a perfect look at what will do well and what will not do well, but just trying to bridge the gap between this really nuanced climate data and the general public and decision makers. They're not typically the same people. So these are people like city arborists, landscape architects, nursery managers, residents, basically anybody selecting a tree to plant. So I use the US Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas for this data. They include 134 species on the East Coast, and only 34 of those were ones that I was recommending for the guide. They do like a more general approach. It's not like urban forest specific. So just to give an example of the data that was used, here are 4 species listed. You can see the model reliability is ranked. That was something important for us to look at. The current importance value for Massachusetts. So importance value basically denotes abundance. And then they use 2 different models with 2 different scenarios, one being the low emissions, one being the high emissions, to look at what the future abundance could be, not necessarily making predictions, but just looking at the habitat suitability. You can see they really vary across the different scenarios and the different models. So what we did was we averaged those importance values just to get a more holistic view of the possibilities. We looked at that compared to the current importance value and taking into consideration the modification factor score, which is something that the tree atlas assigns per species based on 12 disturbance factors, such as like disease, drought, pollution, as well as 9 biological characteristics, just like shade tolerance, seedling establishment, habitat specificity, that kind of accounts for how they may adapt. So we obviously wanted to make sure that those were medium to high as well. So out of these 4 examples, the sweet gum, the liquid ambar, was the one that was chosen as a candidate for assisted migration. It had high model reliability, was gaining abundance, and it had a fairly large modification factor score. And you can see this as denoted as this symbol in the guide. This is also the one for East Coast Native. And since they've come out with like updated data and more data looking like this, and I encourage anybody to check that out if you're interested, or I would love if somebody would update the guide in the future with this information. It's pretty awesome. But I do want the main takeaway to be obviously that, you know, it's not like just because something does well in an urban environment and is expected to do well under climate change conditions, that's not like the answer to our urban forests by any means. I think we have like a tendency to overplant in urban areas when we find something that does well, which I totally get. It's very exciting. You know, the classic example of the American elm, as you can see in this old photo of Salem, Massachusetts, which certainly doesn't have these elms anymore because of the Dutch elm disease in the early 1900s. Some more cautionary tales is the maples, especially in like Worcester County, getting damaged by the Asian longhorn beetle. We're currently dealing with the emerald ash borer, although, you know, ash aren't as significant amount of our species composition as compared to like how the American elm was. And then definitely looking out for the spotted lanternfly in the future. So the general rule of thumb is the 10-20-30 rule to protect against this type of canopy loss. So that's planting no more than 10% of a species in an area, no more than 20% of a genus in an area, and no more than 30% of the same family. And I've heard experts say that it should be like more of like a 5, 10, 20 rule, which definitely I don't think is a bad idea, but it can be difficult to implement for sure. There are a lot of challenges when using these approaches, specifically assisted migration, LSA. It's very complex to forecast species range shifts. There's so many different factors to consider, like local population genetics, slow growth rate of trees, microclimates. And then when you add in, all the dynamic issues of urban areas that are very difficult to analyze, such as heat island effects, altered soil, precipitation runoff, fragmentation, hinders almost no natural migration that could be observed. And it also doesn't account for management issues, which I'll get more into in the next slide. And it is a relatively new area of study, and there is changing data, like I just mentioned. So just take it all with a grain of salt, although it still is very important and still should be implemented, but just keeping that in mind. I think, the status quo is easier and accepted at this time. So still choosing the trees that we know do well, because there is primarily a financial risk, but also an ecological risk. So that is something that it definitely presents a challenge, and I definitely understand it more than I did as a student looking at it through an academic lens. And solutions might be a strong word, but just some things that could help address these issues when you're looking at climate data or you're reading the guide. I did try to create the sense of nuance within the guide, but it is really important to add both local and general knowledge when you're making these type of decisions. Just an example of local knowledge is, if you're looking at a red maple's climate data, you see that it's maybe going to do well, it has high levels of adaptability predicted. But if you're in Worcester County, a local arborist would tell you maybe to hold off on planting that for now. But you wouldn't necessarily know that just looking at the data. Another example generally is, I had talked about how liquid ambar is shown to gain new habitat suitability in the Northeast, which is great, but an urban forester will tell you that they're terrible street trees. This might just be kind of a San Jose thing, but probably 10 or 20 years ago, they planted them everywhere and they're just not doing great at well. And kudos to this group for opening up lines of communication, kind of discussing what's doing well and what's not. I think that's the way of the future, and the internet is great for that. And as I had mentioned before, you can select the greatest species palette ever, but if you're not providing proper tree care and regular maintenance, it's just not worth it in the end. A lot of different municipalities have different people responsible, especially for their street trees. So that can cause big issues in the urban forest, I've found. So it is important to have education for current and future stewards of these trees, while also advocating for improved policies and funding. It is ideal to have a city caring for these trees. Also funding inventories and management plans is really influential, and voting for candidates who care about the environment, of course. I included my resources and some interactive tools that I enjoy. especially the tree equity in Boston map. Shout out to Speak for the Trees. This is the way if you are interested in finding the guide. If you're ever in San Jose, please plant a tree with me. And I would love if you would contact me with more questions, or feel free to ask them now. I see there's some in the chat. Ooh, the cicadas.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for your talk. It was very enlightening. It was really some really interesting research. I know that in my region, we've been thinking about climate resilience. I'm sure that a lot of other people on this call have also been thinking about that. So it's great to know what tools are available for us. So thank you very much. And yes, there are some questions. There was a question about the impact of the brood X, is that what it's called, cicadas this year, if anyone knows how that might impact urban city trees, please pipe up. I personally am not sure what that impact will look like. Does anyone have any experience with these 17 years ago or sometime in the past?
Well, basically, if a tree is happy, and particularly if it's a mature tree, the answer is hardly nothing. Where we saw impacts were with very young trees, because as they, it looks like somebody installed a zipper in the bark on the little twigs and then left it unzipped, just the best way I can describe it. So parts of the bark get ripped up. So if you have a couple branches like that, even on a small newly planted tree, you're good to go. But it is possible that, you know, one of those trees might see a lot of egg laying action. And in that case, you know, you might lose that newly planted tender little tree. That's my experience anyway.
Thanks, Carol-Ann. Appreciate it. And you also had a question for Ashley about the potential of disjunct species like yellowwood, which wouldn't rank high on population level or ability to migrate, but they are very suited, or but the very environmental conditions they are suited for may be a good fit for the future. So Ashley, do you have any experience with some of those different species that might not migrate, but potentially translocation could be an option for them?
Yeah, I did include that species in the guide. I feel like it is important to think about those species that are almost like undervalued or not planted a ton. Sorry, I don't under. Could you repeat the question? Lost my train of thought.
Yeah, sure. So Carol-Ann was just asking about disjunct species that don't migrate and don't rank high on population level, but could be suited for environmental conditions in the future.
Yeah, I think like I wouldn't plant a whole street full of them, but I think like here and there, like the more people that kind of, I don't want to say test them out, but I think that we should be like willing to kind of like take a chance on those types of species and see how they do, maybe like in the privacy of our backyard for now. But yeah, I'm fully behind that.
Great. Becky Schwartz also asked where we can find your report, Ashley.
I'm going to type it in the chat, but it's urbanforestrytoday.org, and then it's under publications. And that is my colleague Rick Harper's website, and he has like a lot of great webinars on there if anybody is interested in checking that out.
Awesome. We can also, I will download that and I can send it around to the listserv with the recording from today as well.
Nice. I think anytime we say something is urban tolerant or does well as a street tree, we need to qualify that statement. Do we mean can grow with almost no soil or grow if properly treated? Great question. I feel like any tree could grow, not any tree, but I think most trees could grow in an urban environment if they were like really given attentive care. And it is definitely like a fuzzy line of what's urban tolerant, but I kind of meant it as does well as a street tree and like has been shown to do well as a street tree without having to like coddle it, and can do well in poor conditions. But that's a very great question.
I also had a question. You mentioned the different types of ways to move species from one location to another. And I know that there are some practical experiments happening. Bartlett might be doing some of how southern species do in more northern ranges. Do you know if there is a higher rate of success for practices like range expansion versus translocation? Just thinking about for urban practitioners, what you mentioned about price and the cost being a factor. There's a more, I'm rambling, but a more successful practice or less successful practice.
Yeah, I feel like I don't often hear about translocation unless it's like in an arboretum where it does have like intense and really high level care. I don't know that people are like super willing to experiment with a lot of translocation, especially in the urban forest. I do know that there's like a lot more like reforestation types of assisted migration experiments. I would assume that, you know, the further ones don't necessarily do better, but I haven't been caught up on the research lately. But if anybody knows of any studies, let me know.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. Becky has another question. What are some trees that came out of your study that excite you, that you'd recommend planting more often, or underutilized tree species to plant more often?
Ooh, I've been in California for so long. I don't, let me look through the guide a little bit. I feel like I was kind of excited about hawthorns. I feel like I don't see those a ton, and I just like kept finding a lot of great things about them in the literature that I wasn't expecting to find. What else do I have? Oh, the thornless Osage orange.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of high stakes because if you do get the thorns and the fruits, that's just like no good for a street. But if you get the right variety, I think it's like a great tree. I'd love to see more dawn redwoods, black gums, hop hornbeams, maybe in the right situation. The proteas, there's some good ones in here. But yeah, I can definitely email you more thoughts if you're interested.
I was also thinking about the potential for doing experimental plantings in various microclimates in each of our cities. There's a pretty magnificent southern magnolia in Pittsburgh. It's enormous. It's been there for decades, and it grows so well because it is in a sheltered position. So perhaps as we are thinking of doing this assisted migration with some more southern style species, doing experimental type plantings in some more sheltered areas could be a good way to test if they could be suitable in our areas.
Totally. I agree. We do have a lot of southern magnolias in San Jose. They're just about to bloom. Beautiful. Yeah, I wish it was easier to like coordinate more like small scale experiments, but you know, it's hard to like make the case for planting a tree that you don't know if it's gonna live or not, especially like on the tight budgets of urban forestry. But yeah, choosing those like microclimates that might be like a little bit better. But I kind of think of like urban environments as microclimates, like at least like temperature wise. So like thinking about that as like a warmer area than the surroundings.
Well, if I could just jump in and build on that, because, you know, there's some interesting things happening, like the Throwing Shade project in Richmond, where people have done, you know, fanned out through the urban area and done real-time temperature modeling. So it would be fabulous, I think, to, you know, Kinsey, I love this idea, to pair that with some experimental planting. Because, you know, it's relatively easy data to get. They're also fairly cheap now, air pollution monitors. And while they get sniffed at a lot, the truth is if you calibrate them, you can do pretty well. And so I would love to see that kind of an effort combined with some experimental plantings, because that would give you a really interesting data stream. And expense-wise, I mean, you could sell that puppy as a grant. I mean, I bet you that would not be hard. And then the other thing, Kinsey, to your idea, for those of us in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, you could certainly, I imagine, easily get a mini grant from Chesapeake Bay Trust to do that kind of a planting. I don't know what the resources are everywhere else, but good thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. I had a thought. It flew away from my brain, so.
Becky, I think you made a great point about nursery availability and cost. I feel like I would like us to influence nursery managers as well, but that is like also a big risk for them to like keep random species in stock, ones that like might not sell, but I wish they would.
Are there any more questions for Ashley?
Feel free to email me. If not, I'll drop my address in the chat.
I would say, Ashley, that there was a time when that was completely the situation. I'm old. So back when we were first, you know, putting together the concepts of conservation landscaping, we had all the landscape architects that said, we can't spec native trees because we can't buy them, nobody grows them. And the nursery people said, we can't grow native trees because nobody specs them. And that was literally the condition. And so we were like, you know, guys, get together in the back of the room. You know, so depending on your funding sources, if it's possible for you to do a little contract growing, that obviously makes a huge difference. But even if it's not, if you can meet with them and let them know that you know you have an interest like this, and share that with your colleagues, you know, around the area, because it seemed an insoluble problem. And yet within, I want to say, 10 years, we went from a region where it was really hard to buy native plants to a place where we had a lot of good choice and a lot of people to go to. And another thing I would look out for is, you know, those small passion nurseries. They may not be able to like source your whole street tree planting, but they absolutely can get you those bits and pieces that you need. You know, so, or even in some cases, there are nonprofit nurseries, or partner with your local parks department that may have their own growing program. It's a lot of work. I'm not trying to make it sound easy, but.
Yeah, I work at Our City Forest, which is like a nonprofit And we do have like a nonprofit nursery, and we do try to like incorporate some of those. And we recently had like a parks department come to us to do like a contract grow of bald cypress trees that like aren't really seen in the area, but we're like, if you can fund us, we'll do it. So yeah, like I see what you mean. That's crazy about the native plants though. I wouldn't have thought that.
I was thinking about this network as well, and how we are very well set up to inform each other about the successes of different species, since we are arranged from north to south. I can talk to David and do some thinking about how we can move forward with having these discussions of maybe sharing species lists of things that we plant, so that, you know, Philadelphia can go down to DC and see what you're planting there, and Boston can go down to Philadelphia, and we can have some more of that sort of exchange between members of this network.
That would be so cool.
Yeah.
That's the dream.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
To learn from each other. Well, if there are there any further questions or any discussion topics anyone wants to raise? There aren't. We had a little bit of a short day today. Thank you again, Ashley, for your presentation. It was really enlightening. I'll be sure to send out some of those links and a copy of your study as well to the group. This is being recorded, so this will be available if you want to review it in the future or send it to any colleagues you have. And next month, our meeting will be on May 19th, and Mark Majewski will be speaking about the Urban Forest Inventory and Analysis Program at the USFS. So we can look forward to that for May. Thanks everyone for coming today, and look forward to seeing you on the next call.
Thanks for having me. Thank you guys.
Wonderful rest of your week.